Okay, hi everyone and welcome to the next in this exciting series of audio lectures that I'm doing for you. They're still a bit awkward, but hopefully they'll get less awkward. In fact, hopefully we won't need them for very much longer. Today we're going to be talking about data, surveillance and social media corporations. The theme of this week is power. So what we're interested in this week is how issues relating to power manifest in the online space, and also how the online space helps to shore up and support different forms of power in ways that we may not necessarily think of in advance, because, you know, as we've discussed frequently throughout this class, there is often this collective sense of the internet being sort of a utopian free space. So what we're interested in this week is the fact that it is not at all a free space in terms of the two themes that we're talking about, because social media actually exists to, or actually helps to strengthen existing power dynamics. So you can start by opening the PDF, and we're currently looking at slide 1, of course. So let's start off by thinking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about the idea of surveillance. If we look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition, surveillance means close observation, especially of a suspected spy or criminal. So from the get-go, even definitionally, there's something in this word surveillance that suggests that the person who is being looked at has already done something bad, right? They're already being criminalized. The etymology of this word, the origins of this word, it's French. It comes from surveiller, which means to watch over. So the French original version of the word is not necessarily sinister. It can also imply things like protecting or keeping an eye out for something, but the way that it's taken on meaning in English suggests that the object of this surveillance gaze is something that is threatening or dangerous or badly behaved or somehow deviant that needs to be watched. Now, the purpose of surveillance is to make a population visible. This thing about visibility is that something that you can see is also something that you can control. Now, we can see this in abundant examples in our own history in this country. So, for example, apartheid racial classification allowed the state to make everyone visible, not only so that it could say, you know, you live here, you can do this job, you can have more money, you can't. It also allowed the state to go, well, you're classified colored, you can't marry this white person. You're classified white, you can't have sex with this black person. So this visibility allowed the state to keep tabs on social behaviors as well as economic possibilities. When we think about contemporary surveillance, one of the things that might come up is the so-called watch lists of suspected terrorists who kept under surveillance by states all over the world in case they pose a threat to other citizens or the state. And we might, you know, initially think, well, this is really important and significant. Of course, we don't want to be the victim of terror attacks. We want to keep suspected terrorists on watch lists. But this form of surveillance becomes a lot more complex when we consider how very many people are on these watch lists and the sorts of reasons that people are on these watch lists, because a lot of the time one will find that people end up on these sorts of watch lists merely because they're Muslim and because they've traveled to countries in Arabic regions that the global north associates with terrorism. So surveillance is not necessarily uncomplicated, but even being the object of surveillance can criminalize you. It can suggest to watchers or to others that you somehow deserve to be the object of surveillance. So the two questions that I would ask you guys if we were in class, which I'd like you to think about. Number 1, who are you watching? Who are you watching in the digital media space? Are you watching celebrities on Twitter or Instagram? Are you watching your friends? Are you keeping tabs on your partner? Are you checking up on your exes? Are you trying to see if you can find your lecturers on Facebook to see if they've got any embarrassing photos? Are you Googling yourself to see what comes up? Who are you watching? And the second question is, who is watching you? Are your parents checking up on you? Are your friends just checking you out to see what you're doing? Are your exes wondering if you're happier in your new relationships? Are they looking at your couple selfies? Are teachers or lecturers checking up on what you get up to make sure that when you've asked for those extensions, they're actually legitimate and it's not because you were clubbing all weekend? That's not me, by the way. I don't do that. Are future employers Googling you to see what comes up? Are the police watching you? Is the university watching you? Is the state watching you? Are marketing and advertising companies watching you to see what they can sell you? Who is watching you in this digital media space in which you feel so comfortable? So the three issues that we're going to discuss in this lecture, firstly, we're going to talk theoretically about the idea of the Panopticon, which I'll explain in a minute. Secondly, we're going to talk about social media surveillance and hegemony. And thirdly, I'm going to touch on social media surveillance in daily life. And this is where we would like to think about case studies and issues where this stuff relates to your own lives. So, of course, we can't discuss this as a group, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it later. And it's something that I would like you to think about in some detail. So let's start with the Panopticon. You can move on to page 2 of the PDF here. The Panopticon is an idea that was developed by an 18th century British man called Jeremy Bentham, Bentham. Bentham was a philosopher, he was a theorist, he was a social reformer. He had a lot of strong ideas about morality and about how to improve society. So he actually designed the Panopticon as an institutional building. The word Panopticon means all-seeing. Pan means all, optic means seeing. So the idea is that it is an all-seeing building. The Panopticon was originally designed as a prison. So what you've got is you've got a circular design with the cells all the way around the sides of the prison and a huge watchtower in the middle of the prison and a big kind of hole in between the two of them. So the idea is that all the prisoners who are in all the cells all the time can always be seen by the observation tower in the center. They can't see into the observation tower, but they can always be seen, so they never know whether they're being watched or not. There are communication tubes running from the observation tower to the cells that allow the guards to speak to the prisoners. And theoretically, what Bentham came up with was the idea that the prisoners would actually self-regulate. Right? Instead of you needing lots of security, lots of guards, instead of prisons being expensive and dangerous places, prisoners would always behave properly because they never know whether they're being watched. So they always behave as though they are being watched, which means they actually internalize the prison guards. So in this conception, prisoners are living in a state of permanent visibility, right? There's no privacy. They're regulated through observation, or more importantly, through the threat of observation, because it doesn't really matter whether anyone is actually in the watchtower or not if you think you're always being observed. Bentham's Panopticon never really got built, although a few prisons were made using elements of this model. If you go online and Google Panopticon prisons, you'll find a lot of prisons around the world that drew on Bentham's idea, although none of them were really this kind of tall tower with cells all around the sides and a watchtower that he'd come up with. More importantly, for our purposes than the active use of the Panopticon as a prison, is the fact that Bentham's theory, has lots of currency, has lots of use among other important theorists and thinkers. You can now move on to slide number 3 of the PDF. So Michel Foucault, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with, who's an incredibly influential French theorist who talks a lot about power, very, very interested in power and society. In his book Discipline and Punish, which was originally published in 1975, he adopted Bentham's idea of the Panopticon and used it as a metaphor for the workings of power in modern society, particularly with regard to how institutions work. So Foucault says, and this is the quote that I've given you, he says, "He who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection. So what he's saying here is that the prisoner, who of course is not necessarily a he, the prisoner may be a she or a they, the prisoner internalizes the requirements of the control culture. The prisoner becomes both the prisoner and the guard. Because the prisoner is always so conscious of the fact that she or he is being watched, she or he plays the role of guarding him or herself. So the inmate is always visible. The inmate becomes the object, not the subject of communication. The inmate is something that is spoken about rather than something that speaks. Also important in Foucault's understanding is the fact that the person who's in the surveillance tower remains anonymous, right? We never actually see the person. If we're the inmate in the Panopticon prison, we don't see who's inside the surveillance tower. We don't know who the guards are. We just know that they're there, and we behave appropriately because we know they can see everything that we do, and they will punish us if we don't behave appropriately. And one of the consequences of that is that means that the person inside the surveillance tower is anonymous and can get away with almost anything, right? The person running the control culture can get away with an awful lot because they are not seen. Although they are omnipresent and we all know that they're there, they are also not visible. They're not invisible in the sense that we don't know that they're there. They're invisible in the sense that we know they're there and we cannot see them, but we know they're there. What does this remind us of? This reminds us of traditional religious, monotheistic, Judeo-Christian conceptions of God. This powerful force that is there, you can't see it, it's totally invisible in the sense that you can't see it, but it's also hypervisible because you know it's there and you know it's watching you. And it can see you do bad things. So it regulates your behavior and ensures that you behave in ways that are appropriately moral, in ways that society has decided are appropriate. So in a way, the entire conception of God within monotheistic cultures is actually constructing God as a panopticon gaze, a thing that we cannot see, but it makes us behave better, it makes us self-regulate if we believe, because we think we might get in trouble if we don't behave properly. Now Foucault says that this design of the panopticon can be used to control all sorts of people. He says it's not just for prison inmates. For example, he says this is how we deal with school children, with mental patients, with factory workers. We suggest to them that they're always being watched, that they're always the object of a surveillance gaze, and then they behave better. So what this does, in Foucault's conception, is this make institutions more efficient. And these are the institutions that structure modernity, that structure capitalism. So, for example, workers in a factory, they can't steal or take overly long breaks because there's this sort of panopticon eye up top in the factory, whether it's the owner or the manager, whether it's their line manager, whether it's a CCTV camera, whether it's metal detectors checking on them coming in and out of the factory, whatever the view is, in whichever way they're being watched, they have to behave in a way that's more efficient. They become more like cogs in a machine, so the overall structure of the factory will keep operating and capitalism will do better, more money will be earned, right? Regardless of the consequences for the human consequences for the people working in that factory. The panopticon gaze ensures that the institution remains efficient and that they do what they need to do to help capitalism reproduce itself. In this conception, the panopticon doesn't even need anyone to be watching, right? You don't need anyone in this tower. Power actually just becomes self-replicating. It controls the population automatically without any need for human intervention. It doesn't matter whether there's anyone really behind the CCTV camera or not. If the worker believes that there is, the worker will behave in a way that power thinks is appropriate. So human intervention becomes irrelevant and power just starts to replicate itself. So Foucault goes far beyond what Bentham has said, and he suggests that the panopticon model is actually how modern society works. We're all aware that we're constantly being watched, and so we internalize these rules and we police ourselves and our own behavior and each other. So in Foucault's version of the world, the Panopticon isn't necessarily architectural or structural. It doesn't have to be a building. It doesn't have to be physical. It's a state of permanent visibility. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about coercive power, right? We're talking about a type of power that's related to hegemony. And obviously, I spoke a lot about hegemony in terms of what we were doing last week. So hopefully you've listened to that lecture and internalized the coercive understanding of hegemony that I was talking about. When we talk about hegemony, we're talking about rule by common consent. We are not forced to behave properly. There's no physical force. The force is internalized. The force is more subtle. It's suggested. The structures of modernity create a world where we feel like we could get into trouble at any moment, and so we tend to behave in ways that will avoid that, right? We internalize the gaze of whether it's the prison guard, or whether it's the factory owner, or whether it's the teacher, or whether it's the institution, or whether it's the state, or whether it's a god that we think might punish us. Whatever the thing is that we internalize it. We internalize this. We are not ruled by force. We're ruled by something that we generally consent to. Okay, at this point you can move on to slide number 4 in the PDF that I gave you. Slide number 4 is full of images. I've got 2 images of Ponty. So we're all familiar with Ponty, right? We're all familiar with Ponty in Hillbrow. I hope we are. Now, there was a proposal in the mid-1990s to turn Ponty into a prison. I haven't been able to find any specific plans for how this was intended to happen, but the circular design of Ponty suggests that some sort of permanent visibility was planned for prisoners, and that's why this was going to happen, right? This huge tower that was at the time in complete disarray, really, really dangerous. The central stairwell was literally full of rubbish. There were urban legends about bodies decaying in the middle of Ponty. There was a sense in Johannesburg that the best thing we could do with this disastrous building was turn it into a prison, because we needed more prisons and we needed things to be visible. This desire for visibility has a long history in South Africa, as I suggested at the start of this lecture. During apartheid, particularly in townships, there was an enormous amount of work done to make people visible. Not only through passbooks and racial classification, but also literally making them physically visible on a daily basis so that they could be controlled easily and would behave more properly. Any of you who've grown up in townships will be familiar with the big grid systems that you find in a lot of places, not the informal settlements, but the settlements that were designed by the state. These big grid systems with big wide roads and really high, quite bright lighting towers that often feel like they could belong in football, in soccer stadiums. And the reason that this was done was you have huge light towers and big grid systems so that military vehicles can travel through townships at night, and the areas will be lit up and the military vehicles can see everything and stop people from misbehaving. That's obviously misbehaving in inverted commas. So in the same way in which prisoners in Bentham's version of the prison were objects, not subjects of communication, this kind of compulsory visibility made black South Africans subjects rather than citizens of the state, right? Rather than being active in the state, they were things that could be seen and needed to be controlled by the state. And this hyper-visibility, this panopticon visibility that was designed spatially into the older townships is actually part of making this panopticon possible, to a state, a military, a police gaze. In contemporary Joburg, we find this as well. I'm sure some of you will be aware that there are now an awful lot of CCTV security cameras in the CBD of Joburg, inside town. And this has led to a major drop in inner city crime. The statistics are quite surprising. Now, the drop in crime is not only because the cameras mean that police can be quicker to catch people, but also because people know that they're being watched, so they behave differently. Current modes of management and visibility of populations in South Africa include things like biometric identity cards, biometric cards for getting welfare money if you're a pensioner, or if you're a child, or if you have children rather, or if you're disabled. So in order to function, you need to be visible to the state, and being visible to the state means to some extent you are controllable, not only because the state knows what you're doing, but because you know that the state knows what you're doing. You are internalizing this Panopticon gaze. We also see this kind of thing institutionally in, for example, the way that certain employers issue identity cards. So they can see what you do. They can see when you leave a building, when you exit the building, where you are, whether you're at your desk at what time. Now, employers may not necessarily be looking at this data. They may not even be interested. But the fact that they can tell, the fact that they have the option of using this surveillance technique to see whether you're doing your job appropriately, means that you may very well behave differently because you have internalized this surveillance Panopticon gaze. So the question that I would ask you guys now if we were in class was, can you think offhand of any examples of this sort of thing in your own lives? Can you think of any examples of the way in which you self-police because you know you might be watched? And, because I have no shame. The example from my life that I was going to give you was from when I was a teenager, and I was really, really badly behaved, and I started smoking cigarettes when I was really young, and I would self-police where I smoked, even though my parents weren't around and my teachers weren't around. There were certain spaces in which I was aware of the fact that adults who may know me may be present, and so those spaces I behaved appropriately, and then in other spaces I did not self-police. And even though no one ever caught me smoking and told my mom, thank goodness, I still regulated my own behavior because I knew that there was a chance that I would be under some sort of surveillance, that I would be behaving appropriately or behaving inappropriately. So it's a small example, but it is an example of the way in which I was not coerced to behave properly. I chose to behave properly because I was very, very aware of the possibility of surveillance. Okay, so to move on to part 2 of this lecture. In this section, I'm going to talk about social media surveillance and hegemony. So we're moving on from theoretical notions around the Panopticon and talking specifically about social media, and particularly about social media corporations. So hopefully you should all be very, very familiar with the idea of hegemony by now. Now, the social media situation requires us to extend Foucault's ideas slightly. Because within social media, surveillance is not pushed on us by external powers or by external institutions, right? We're not being viewed by a teacher or a lecturer. We're not being spied on by CCTV cameras. We're not being checked on necessarily by the state, although also, of course, that does come into play with social media. Rather, in a lot of situations with social media, we actually willingly sign up for it because it's become such a common component of social life. So even though we all kind of sort of know that it makes us available to surveillance, we sign up for it willingly because this is how we communicate in a digital age. What social media does is it in fact normalizes the hypervisibility that is a consequence of surveillance. It makes being hypervisible to everyone and everything around us feel completely normal, so we stop questioning it. This is one of the features of hegemony, right, is normalization. It makes things seem as though they're natural. They just are the way that they are. So you can move on now to slide 5. I'm going to talk a little bit about Facebook. I'm going to use Facebook as the main example here and refer a bit to Google. But of course, what we're talking about refers to other social media spaces as well. So Facebook bought Instagram in 2012 for $1 billion. And it bought WhatsApp in 2014 for $19 billion. Facebook owns an awful lot of significant social media spaces. And you've got to consider, right, if they're spending, that's $20 billion for 2 other platforms. If they're spending $20 billion for platforms that you use for free, they must be making an awful lot of money somewhere. Now, in 2012, Facebook publicly acknowledged that it collected 2.5 billion content items per day. So those content items are things like status updates, wall posts, photos, videos, and comments. 2.5 billion every day. Facebook collected in 2012 2.5 billion likes every day, 300 million photos, and ingested more than 500 terabytes of new data into its databases every day. I can't even tell you how much a terabyte is, but it's an awful, awful lot. Of course, Facebook is not the only major corporation involved in this stuff. Google bought Android for only $50 million in 2005, bought YouTube for $1.6 billion in 2006. Companies like Apple and Microsoft also use, sell, collect all the data that you happily give them, that we all happily give them all the time. So a question that I would ask you if we were in class is whether any of you have actually have been on Facebook and have changed your mind, and whether if you have, you've actually tried to delete rather than just disable a Facebook profile, because it's very difficult to delete a Facebook profile. If you disable your Facebook profile, you come online and you find out that absolutely nothing vanished. So nothing goes away, right? Facebook keeps everything, and they make it quite hard for you to get away from them. So what we need to think about, if we're talking about hegemony and we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about people allowing themselves to be under surveillance in this really easy way that seems so naturalized, the question then that we need to think about is, how do social media corporations manufacture consent? How do they create a hegemony? How do they create this situation where we comfortably and happily agree to being under surveillance in this way? So you can move now to slide 6 in the PDF. And you've got images here, firstly pulled from the Facebook data use policy from their from their page, and secondly 2 images of the Google servers in different parts of the US, right? These are big, scary data centers that hold an awful lot of information, that actually is yours, which you comfortably gave away to them without thinking. So let's think about how social media corporations go about manufacturing consent. One of the things that social media corporations do is they utilize discourse and semiotics very, very carefully and very cleverly. So let's think, for example, about this Facebook privacy policy, this data use policy. This page is designed to look really simple and accessible, right? It says things like your information on Facebook, interactive tools, videos. We're working on communicating about privacy in a simpler, more interactive way. It says at the top, let us know what you think by commenting here. It's comments. You can tell us what you think. We're interested. We're open to listening to you. There's a discursive sense here that the user of the platform is just as important as the owner of the platform. So you can interact, you can tell Facebook what you think, but then if you look a little bit further, it also says this isn't our official privacy policy, which can be found here. Now, if you click on that link, you will get this really, really, really complex, really impenetrable privacy policy that doesn't actually really make it clear what's going on unless you're really familiar with the kind of legalistic language that Facebook uses. And interestingly as well, on this page, you can see the symbol of the trustee certificate, right? So it says, Facebook has been awarded trustee's privacy seal. Doesn't that make you feel more confident? It should make you feel more confident because it's explicitly designed to make you feel more confident. Some external body gave Facebook a certificate for being so trustworthy and so good about privacy. However, trustee is actually an industry body, right? Trustee is a group that was started by people who work in Silicon Valley. They decided to self-regulate privacy. It's not regulated by governments or by NGOs. It was originally started as a non-profit, but it's actually a company that earns money, and it's backed by money from people within the tech industry. So these are people within this industry awarding themselves their own certificates saying your privacy settings are fine. The use of the word trust this image of the certificate, all of this stuff is designed to make Facebook seem as trustworthy as possible. But actually, the certificate doesn't really mean an awful lot. It doesn't tell us very much about what is happening to our data and whether things are happening to our data that we wouldn't necessarily approve of if we were really told about them clearly. If you go through the Facebook privacy policy, you find things like this sentence, or these sentences rather. This is a quote. We collect the content and other information you provide when you use our services, including when you sign up for an account to create or share and message or communicate with others. This can include information in or about the content you provide, such as the location of a photo or the date a file was created. We also collect information about how you use our services, such as the types of content you view or engage with and the frequency and duration of your activities. So despite looking all fluffy and nice and clickable and interactive and modern and accessible on the page that I've given you, and despite having this trustee certificate, what Facebook privacy policy actually says is we collect everything. Every single piece of information that you give us, what you do, when you do it, how long you do it for, who you do it with, every message that you send, every comment that you make, nothing that you do on Facebook is not always available and owned by Facebook. And because they collect it, they're not obliged to get rid of it when you leave Facebook. Everything that you've done is still there. And this is what we are doing. This is how we are making ourselves available to corporate surveillance. Google does the same thing, right? Google is designed to make everything look really easy. It's discursively, semiotically, visually constructed as your entry to a full online life, right? You just need a Google password and you can do anything. You can go anywhere, you can get all sorts of information. Everything's easy. You can access things on all your different devices. Think about all the different things that you can now sign into. You lose your phone. If you've got an Android phone, all you need to do is sign back into your Google account and bang, everything that you've lost will be there. You can sign back into your Uber, your Tinder, whatever it is that, Tinder's Facebook, but whatever the platforms are that you use. You can keep all your data, all your information, everything that you own on Dropbox and sign into Dropbox using your Google account, which means anyone who gets your Google password can access everything on your hard drive if that's how you use Dropbox. Google's original motto was "Don't be evil," and in 2005 they changed this to "Do the right thing," right before they decided to enter the Chinese market with censored searches. So the original idea of "Don't be evil" started changing the bigger that they got. Google's privacy policy saves your name, your email address, your phone number, your credit card details if you enter them, details on how you use Google services, details on how you interact with other websites that use Google technologies, everything that happens on your Google device, any search queries that you make ever. The privacy policy actually states, if other users already have your email or other information that identifies you, we may show them your publicly visible Google profile information such as your name and photo. So the ways in which social media corporations like Google and Facebook construct consent are partly discursive and semiotic, right? They make these pages that make them look trustworthy. They have these mottos that make them sound trustworthy. They make themselves seem really simple and accessible and user-friendly, and by doing that they seem less threatening. They seem much less frightening than submitting your ID or your documents or your details to a government agency that seems faceless and frightening. So semiotically and discursively, they manufacture consent by making themselves appear and feel trustworthy. Another way in which social media corporations and social media platforms manufacture consent is through structure. So as I said, with Google, you have the ability to sign into all sorts of different things. The same with Facebook. So then they can collect all of that data and information because you've willingly provided it to them by signing in. Also, the capacity to share things and tag things. So even if you've never had a Google account or a Facebook account, other people who do have these things can email you, they can message you, they can Facebook you, they can tag you, they can share things with you, they can send you information, and your information as a non-user can still get collected by those corporations. If you go through the whole rigmarole of entirely deleting everything in your Facebook account or in your Google account, Google or Facebook can still hold on to data and information that Google and Facebook users have provided about you. So you will not be invisible to those corporations even if you try. Those corporations still own other things that people have posted about you. So one example is of facial recognition software. And I think I spoke about this in the first lecture, that social recognition software is really problematic. Now, when I was, I just keep giving you guys stories about my misspent youth. When I was in my early 20s and living in London, all the anti-capitalist protests started happening around the world. Around the G8. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this stuff, but this anti-capitalist movement for a moment was very, very powerful, and it was talking about different ways of running the world. It was protesting against a lot of horrible things that governments did. So when I was young and I was getting involved in these protests, police would do something where what it was called was kettling. You'd have, 10,000, 20,000 people on the streets of London, and the police would kettle you. They would come in from the sides of the streets and they would push you into a really small area, and you would then be stuck there for hours. They'd keep you in there. You wouldn't be allowed out to go for a wee. I remember seeing a pregnant lady having a wee in a policeman's helmet once. That was funny. Nobody would be allowed to move. Even if you were sick, they would just keep you in there. They'd keep you in there for hours. And this is how they would do public order policing, by just having a lot of police, no guns, no bullets, very little use of tear gas and that sort of thing. They would just have these strong policemen who would keep you kettled in a small area. And then when they wanted to let you out, they would let you out one by one. And each person who was let out would have a photograph taken of them. Which is why activists in the early 2000s, and a lot of activists now who are very conscious of CCTV surveillance, cover their faces with black cloth so you can't see them. My face is somewhere on a police database, somewhere in the UK, because I was involved in marches. And this is what facial recognition software does, right? So the facial recognition software that Facebook uses on a daily basis, if the UK government decides it wants to investigate me, it can look me up using the facial recognition software that Facebook has, and it can match me to those shots that were taken in its database in the early 2000s. And that then gives an enormous amount of power and information. And this is to do with the structural nature of these social media platforms and spaces. This is, of course, related to your essay question, right? We're talking here about how structure impacts on the way that social media and society intersect. The third way in which social media corporations manufacture consent is through naturalization. So everything, this is so strongly related to hegemony, everything seems natural and normal. We don't think about the fact that Google is curating the world for us. When we do a search, we just do a search, and what comes up. We don't think about things like search engine optimization or the way that Google changes the results of your search according to your previous searches. So you think you're just getting access to unfettered information, when really what you're getting is access to information that is being processed by algorithms that are designed specifically to give you the answers that Google thinks you want. It's the same with Twitter and Facebook. They're organizing what we see and the way that we see it. So these social media spaces create an illusion of freedom and an illusion of privacy, when in fact online monopolies mean that a lot of our data is available to other actors, to other stakeholders. Things that are free are not really free, but they naturalize and normalize the fact that this is just how information works these days. We don't think there's anything strange telling Facebook where we are or what we're doing this weekend or who we're hanging out with. But Facebook is using that information in ways that we don't understand and can't respond to. So then finally, to go on to the third section of this lecture, this is the issue of social media surveillance in our daily lives. And this is something that we can't really discuss in full in an audio lecture, because this is something that you guys need to talk to me about or talk to each other about. But there are three important issues here. Firstly, Social media makes us visible to our friends, our family, our followers, potentially even anyone with an internet connection, depending on which platform we're talking about and what our privacy settings are like. Secondly, social media means that we become visible to the social media corporation that owns the platform that we are using. Thirdly, social media means that we become visible to anyone that the social media corporation shares our information with. So there was the example given in the reading of oil companies using material made available on social media by activists to monitor activist activities. So oil companies are joining groups of activists on Facebook and looking at everything that they say and deciding on their strategies and what they're going to do. So social media gives us, as activists, new capacities to organize globally, but it also means that people we are organizing against can check up on us despite our what might be attempts to be private. So this counters the utopian notion of the internet as a place of political freedom. This is really significant because it's a later development that's happened now that big corporations have the most control over online spaces. The internet wasn't originally like this. It was originally a lot more anarchic. And one of the big wars going on around the digital space for a while now has been around how anonymous it is and how anonymous it can be. Corporates and states want it less anonymous. Groups like Anonymous itself and hackers and people who design online spaces generally want it to be more anonymous. And one example that relates to our own lives right now is the way in which activists and protesters involved in the protests at WITS at the moment are using Twitter to organize. But that also means that the university is looking at Twitter, and the university is developing its strategies in relation to what activists are saying online. So the online space of organizing is also an online space of surveillance. In terms of us becoming visible to social media corporations, Google is often approached by states to release data. Google's search histories can be used to define people as terrorists. States request information from these corporations and use it to track people. Sometimes the corporations give it up, sometimes they don't. A recent example was of the twins who were arrested in South Africa who were allegedly related to Al-Qaeda. A lot of the reporting suggested that we knew that they were related to Al-Qaeda because of what they had used their cell phones for, that they were using the internet to contact quote-unquote outside people. So what we do on social media can actually be used to condemn us. Now, whether or not these guys were involved with Al-Qaeda is irrelevant to our argument here. What is relevant is that the internet allowed them to make these forms of contact, but the internet also then allowed them to be classified as terrorists. So the fact that they were doing stuff online also meant that they were available to online surveillance, and that had consequences for what happened to and with them. And also, we're also visible to anyone that social media corporations share our info with. For example, the marketing and sale of data. What do we think Google and Facebook do with all this data, right? What do we think they do? How do we think they make these enormous billions where they are worth more than lots of states? They do this by selling our information to advertisers and selling our information to other interested parties. So the type of ads that pop up alongside your searches might seem innocuous, they might seem unimportant, but they also mean that all sorts of companies have access to all sorts of information about you. We don't even know whether this information is anonymized, and it can be used in all sorts of different ways, and we are giving it up freely because we have been told, because it's been naturalized, that this is just how we communicate one day. So the final point, the final question here is, what do we do? Right? How do we deal with online surveillance, with social media surveillance, with digital media surveillance? I mean, the only way that we can really avoid these things is to never use search engines, definitely never use social media, don't sign up for an account with anything or anyone, never do things like shopping online, and definitely 100% do not have a smartphone. Smartphones make you trackable. Smartphones make you traceable. You can't use a smartphone without using a platform like Android or, whatever platform is used for iPhones. So if you want to use any of this technology, you will become visible. You will be open to surveillance. You will be accessible. So there's not an awful lot that we can do about it, but what we can do is be conscious, ensure that our privacy settings are set as high as possible, try and avoid giving too much data to individual corporations, try and remember that these companies are not necessarily our friends. They may not be out to get us individually, but the effect that they have on society at large, despite the way in which they market and brand themselves, may not necessarily be positive. Okay, so that's everything for this lecture on social media, data, surveillance, and social media corporations. I hope it hasn't been too depressing, but it is important stuff to think about. And we do need to keep an eye on how we use the online space and what it means for us that we are consistently hyper-visible to all of these different actors and all of these different stakeholders. And this is our first lecture in the session about power. The second lecture that we will have will be about white anxieties as they manifest in social media spaces. So then we're going to be talking about how online imagined communities on the internet have actually allowed for a reconstitution of white privilege and a hidden and rather the bastion of white victimhood, which of course isn't really a legitimate thing. So I hope this has been interesting for you guys, and I hope that I get to see all your faces really soon. As always, please message me or email me or send me questions if you have any, and I'll keep trying to keep you up to date with your classes. Okay, have a good day. Thanks.